Hello, hello. We're here to chat a little bit today about what GDP is, but then mainly why all these different measures of GDP should give us the same number. And when we see differences in them, why that's got to do with little things about how it's measured, not actually anything to do with GDP itself. So let's jump forward and try to get all this done in 15 minutes. Vroom. So, what is GDP? You'll see here I have a factory. And I also have a nice person working away picking some flowers or pumpkins or something. Now, what am I trying to represent with these is that we have capital and we have labor. We call these factors of production, and these factors of production create output. Okay. Now, there I've got some stocked supermarket shelves. I'm not talking about us going and buying things we want from the supermarket. I'm talking about the idea of factors of production within a country creating the production, creating the output that can be used. Okay. Now, there's a subtle difference, although it sounds like I'm just picking hairs, but that's sort of what economists do. I want us to come from the idea of thinking about factors of production, and specifically factors of production that are within a country. Now, let's pick a nice, pretty little country called New Zealand. You see New Zealand sitting there doing its thing. There are factors of production within New Zealand. This doesn't necessarily mean they're owned by New Zealanders, that it's New Zealand residents that are turning around and doing the work that's involved, or that own the factory or put the funds in to build the factory. It's saying that the factors of production are located in New Zealand. Now, when we think about production, we'll sometimes see that there are things that we produce but we don't actually get to use ourselves. We make heaps and heaps of milk and apples here, but it's actually used overseas. They're the ones that eat those delicious apples. And as a result, we're exporting them. Now, they're produced here, so this is part of what we're using factors of production for. Imports, on the other hand, the microphone I'm using, the computer I'm using, these come from overseas, and we get to consume them. I'm getting to enjoy them right now, but we didn't make them here. So when we're talking about GDP, we are thinking about production. I want us to think about production in the same way that we might think about playing a game of civilization. We're looking at how much we could produce if we were on a war footing. We're looking at how many things could be made given the factors of production that are available in the country, the land, the factories, the people. So we're not actually saying anything necessarily about well-being or happiness. We're not talking about how much we get to consume or how much we can use as New Zealand residents necessarily. But there's going to be a relationship between these things. And so this is one of the indicators that it is important to understand. Now, that's enough about GDP, because if we were going to do a GDP video, we'll do a GDP video. Instead, I want us to think about how this is measured and how all the different ways of measuring it will come up with the same thing. And as a result, the ways we think about production or value add, expenditure or income in a macro sense, all end up equaling each other, which is a really important and fundamental concept in macroeconomics. So let's jump into an example of that. We have an economy where all that happens is bread is made and consumed. That's it. Now, the whole production process occurs within the country, so all the necessary factors of production to produce bread are there, and they're all utilized. Now, we could measure GDP in this economy through the production, the income associated with, or the expenditure on bread. But when we think through each of these things, we want to make sure that how we get to the bread is a consistent way of thinking about how bread is constructed. We want to avoid double counting activities if we can, and we also want to make sure we don't miss activities that were necessary in the production of that bread. When we measure GDP in these ways, it should always be the same, which is what we're also going to see as we work through the measures. So to think about bread, we need to think about a vertical chain. Bread doesn't appear out of ether. I know sometimes it feels like that with products. They're just sitting there and we can enjoy them, but there is a vertical chain. And that productive chain goes through a series of inputs that are transformed into further inputs that are transformed until we get output. So we want to characterize this chain and think through how we would count it up so that we can work out what the value added associated with bread is. So for this, we're just going to say there's a farmer, and the farmer sells something to a miller. It'll be wheat. The miller sells something to a baker. In this case, it'll be flour. And the baker uses the flour to construct bread. The consumer then gets bread, and they value that bread. They'll pay a price for it. And in that way, we're going to use prices to try to figure out how we can measure this. Now, why do we use prices rather than just turning up and saying, well, there are 5 loaves of bread, 6 loaves of bread? Because we don't have an economy that's just bread. We have a whole series of different items: bread, chairs, tables, computers, milk. And when we look at that situation where there's all these different products, aggregating them up is difficult. So to aggregate them up, we'll often say, let's take the market price. And we know that if it was a competitive economy, this market price would represent a certain value. And so we can think about it that way. And even when it's not a competitive economy, we know that the price will still represent something about the opportunity cost associated with purchasing that product. So aggregating them up using prices is consistent and sensible, but it is an assumption, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, with prices, we can dive over here and think exactly about what's happening for our farmer, miller, and baker. Our farmer makes some wheat and they sell it for $1. Easy peasy. Our miller takes the wheat, makes some flour, sells that for $2. Our baker buys the flour. They make some bread, and then they sell that bread to a final consumer for $4. End of story. The consumer doesn't on-sell the bread, they eat it. As a result, that is the final use of this bread. If they did on-sell it, well, there would be another link in the chain, and we would be asking ourselves 2 things. With the on-sale, how easily can we measure that? And with that on-sale, do we really think that that person is then adding value to the product? They could well be. They could be helping match in the market because some people were unable to transact with this baker. By adding this service, they would be adding value, and by excluding them, we would be understating GDP. So as you can see, thinking about the measurement helps us think about these measures and helps us think about what is missed when we measure it, because things are constantly missed and it's unavoidable. So production and expenditure. Let's start with how we would measure those. Production is about asking what is the value added at each stage of production. It is not saying wheat is produced, count it. Flour is produced, count it. Bread is produced, count it. If we do that, we're going to overcount everything, because for each of them, we'll be saying there's a market price associated with them. And so we'll say bread is a $4 price, flour is a $2 price, and wheat is a $1 price, and we would get a number of 7. And that isn't actually the amount that's produced. Because in the end, the only product that was finally produced was bread. The flour and the wheat were intermediate. They were inputs to the process of creating the bread. So at each stage, we want to ask how much value was added by that process by comparing the price they receive to the amount they paid in intermediate consumption. How much did it cost for them to get that product from another producer? So the farmer just produces the wheat by growing it and then sells it for $1. Easy peasy, value added is $1. A miller purchased that wheat and turned it into flour. So they took a $1 product and they transformed it and sold it for $2. Their activity, their value added, led to this product going from something that was worth $1 to $2. So value added there is an additional $1. We don't add the $2 on here, we add just the $1. Then the baker took the $2 product, transformed it, and sold it for $4. So their value added is $2. What do you know? GDP is equal to all of the value addeds added up. That's $1 plus $1 plus $2 equals $4. Now, what about expenditure GDP? We haven't given much space on the slide, so it must be pretty easy. So what did the final consumer pay here? Or in a general GDP sense, would be asking, what did the final purchaser of the product pay? Because we'll include other things that aren't consumers there. But in this case, it's a consumer of bread, and they paid $4, so GDP is $4. We have a final good. The final good is bread. Bread sold for $4. Therefore, we can say expenditure GDP is $4. That's the same as on the production side, because in each stage, we're subtracting out intermediate consumption, which is the market price paid for those inputs. So those all fall away. They're all cancelled out. Why do we bother with production GDP then? Because what happens if we want to ask about how value is created across industries? We want to ask ourselves if a certain industry scaled up, or if its resources were reallocated some other way because, say, we went to war and needed to make guns. In that case, you want to understand what industries are adding value and what is the nature of that value. Is it particular to them making that product, or can they reallocate those resources into a different function? Understanding production GDP gives you a perspective on industries where we might have absolute advantages, comparative advantages as a nation, where there is a situation where resources are being reallocated and why. And so production GDP gives us a way of decomposing GDP that expenditure GDP doesn't. Expenditure GDP makes sense for looking at the total GDP number and asking if it comes from consumption, investment, government spending, yada, yada. Production GDP allows us to ask about the industries and ask about that value added. So they both have important components for asking about things we care about. But in aggregate, for the total GDP, the total production number, that will give us the same result. Now, I said there was another measure here called income GDP. Now, if you're feeling lazy, you can just say this is value-added GDP split up in some other ways, because that's right. But there's important stuff in here, especially if we're interested in distributional economics, or talking about income inequality, or discussing, Marxism and factor shares, or Ricardian labor theory of value, all these sorts of things, right? So a lot of the political debates you hear will be coming from a perspective about income GDP. Now, I don't want to get onto those here. What I want us to do is to try to understand what these components are measuring so we can make more informed choices when we have a discussion about this, make more informed judgments, and make sure we're just careful with the terms we use. So with income GDP, what is paid to the factors of production located in the country? So not owned by the residents, but the factors of production that are there. So when they go and do an activity, when that factory is used, when a worker goes out and works, what production is produced from that? It could well be that someone overseas owns the factory, and so they receive the income. But we are counting the income that is paid to the factor, not to the resident. Now, how do we think about this? I want us to simplify it and only think about returns to labor and capital. So other types of value that are captured in terms of entrepreneurial value or a value that goes to land could be captured within the capital concepts, but we're just not going to think about them. So when we think this way, there's a compensation of employees figure, which goes to labor, and a gross operating surplus figure that goes to capital. With our farmer, miller, and baker, they were all capitalists. They owned the means of production in terms of capital, and they were producing a good and selling it. They were helping to do the matching in the market. But to help them in their work, they all wanted to hire someone. The farmer wants someone to help them cut down the wheat. The miller wants someone to help them move around the bags of wheat. And the baker wanted someone to clean the floor and make sure he gets up on time. So they all hire someone for 50 cents, and then they pay what's remaining to themselves as a return to capital. So there's value added from the transaction taking place, and they receive that remaining chunk. If we calculate the return to labor, the compensation of employees, is 50 cents in each case, since we get $1.50. Gross operating surplus, or our return to capital, is the value added minus what is paid to labor. So we're subtracting this additional expense to see what's just left for capital, and that's $2.50. Now, a thing I will note here is this return to capital includes what they need to just repair equipment. It's not just surplus for them to spend, it's gross. So it also includes depreciation. Now, when we add all that up, we get $4. So this measure helps us to understand and talk about the distribution of income between factors of production, but it again gives us the same aggregate measure. Now that's us. We're about to our 15 minutes. So thank you all very much for coming along. Bye.